In the heart of a lightsaber, there's a Kyber crystal that powers it and gives the lightsaber its own unique color, as well as that it forms a connection with the user of the blades and becomes more and more intertwined with them. And while to many people the Kyber crystals are just rocks, they actually are semi-sentient creatures that call out to those who they deem worthy to wield them. In a previous video, I covered every single lightsaber color in Canon and Legends, and so for today's video, I will explain every type of Kyber crystal in both Canon and Legends. Starting with the Ilum class Kyber crystal, this version is most commonly used by the Jedi Order, due to it being found on Ilum, which is where the majority of the Jedi got their Kyber crystals from. These were found deep inside the planet's caves and were widely recognized as the best Kyber crystals to use by the Jedi Order. Within this type of crystal, there's two versions of it, the Methite and the Pontite, and while both can be used for lightsabers, the Methite was typically more common and weak, while the Pontite is stronger and rarer. It would be the Pontite crystals from Ilum that would be harvested for the Death Star, which left the planet a barren husk of its former self. The next type of Kyber crystal was also used for the Death Star construction, the Jedi Kyber crystal, which, as you can probably guess, was found on Jedha and also was commonly used by the Jedi, who deeply admired the beauty of the crystals, as well as the potency of it, which made the blades more focused. But when the Death Star fired the laser at the planet, many of the crystals under the surface would be severely cracked, which in return made the blades very unstable and dangerous. The next Kyber crystal was known as the Christosis crystal, due to it being found on the planet of Christosis, and they're actually fairly common there on that planet, which made them very important to the Jedi Order. The crystal also had a cool ability where it amplified any kinetic energy when swung, which basically meant the Jedi could swing the blade faster and stronger. There also was the Zorphis crystal, found on the planet of Zorf, and while it was originally used during the Old Republic days, it was soon hated by the Jedi due to it producing a very powerful blade that was unstable due to the crystal's unique capabilities. It also was incredibly vulnerable to fluctuations in power, which made it turn off if there wasn't a strong enough dip. Next is the Adigan class Kyber crystal, which were found on the Adiga system. These crystals, unlike some of the others, were lightly force reactive. It was only able to fuse with a limited amount of force wielder's power. They also had a different version known as the Methite crystal, which was a very rare and sparkled very brightly under light. This was best suited for being put inside of lightsabers due to their internal light structure and light module capabilities, but they were constantly emitting a force hum that could be sensed by any force sensitives once they were infused with the force. Next on the list is ghost fire crystals. These crystals, unlike the ones before, were not found on any specific planet, but rather would form on top of mountains or in very deep caverns in remote worlds. These crystals were nearly completely transparent, and what makes these crystals different from the rest is when put into a lightsaber and activated, the blade produced would be dim and transparent, as well as being near silent. And when the blade was swung, it would make a delayed sound which would confuse the opponent, but because of its rarity, it was only found every couple of decades. This next Kyber crystal on the list is actually viewed as the strongest of all the Kyber crystals. It was known as a Kyber crystal. This was an ancient force relic that when used in a lightsaber actually enhanced the user's connection to the force by 1000%. However, many Jedi would take small parts of the crystal and put it into their own lightsabers to amplify their connections to the force, but because of its rarity, it was not often used. Next up is the Kimber stones. Like the next crystals, these were very weak and were unable to create strong blades and rather created ones that could not cut through anything. Next on the list is the Bondar crystal. Unlike the other crystals on this list, these were primarily used for training sabers due to their inability to cut through materials, and instead just stun opponents. And while at first the Jedi disliked it because of that particular weakness, they later realized that the Jedi's main goal was to protect life and not harm it, and so they would soon adapt this into some of their lightsabers. There also was a Corsair gem that was found on Coruscant in the very early days of the galaxy. It was said that when looking into it, as if they were looking into a star. The blade produced was also far more powerful than a regular saber, being able to cut through almost any material with relative ease. The next crystal on the list is the Ultimate Pearl. These pearls were most notably found on the watery world of Dag, and were very expensive and also were very difficult to install into a lightsaber. The only known user of this was the force-sensitive niece of my hero, Admiral Akbar. This next crystal is said to be one of the most expensive crystals in the entire galaxy, known as the Rainbow Crystal. One singular crystal could buy an entire Mon Calamari cruiser, which in simple terms means very expensive. And when put into a lightsaber, the blade would be turquoise and would also enhance the user's connection to the force. Similar to this was the Sun Rider's Destiny crystal, which basically was the same thing as a rainbow crystal, but just a little more common. Next up is obsidian. This is most commonly found on lava worlds or even on remote planets, and when used, the crystal would produce a naturally red blade. Another rare crystal was the Lambin gem. These were synthetic crystals created by the Yuuzhan Vong to help take over the galaxy. These crystals allowed the user to telepathically connect to creatures. They also could sense other Yuuzhan Vong around them, which was very helpful for when Jacen Solo adapted this crystal into his lightsaber. There also was the Danteri crystal, which was used by the Jedi before they discovered Ilum. These eggs were commonly found in the eggs of the Kimrath and were basically the exact same as the crystals on Ilum, except for their ability to replenish the user's ability to use the force in a battle. Next up are the synthetic crystals. These were not found, but rather they were created. In most cases, it would be the Sith that made them. But like we saw with Luke in Legends, the Jedi could also create them, but these crystals, when put into a lightsaber, would be very explosive and unstable, as well as being a lot weaker than typical lightsabers. The next crystal on this list was the Hurricane Crystal, which was most notably used by Mace Windu. These crystals were were only found on the planet of Huracan and are collected by the native race of the Stone People. It was said that when used, could make the user's reflexes faster and give them a deeper connection to the Force. The next crystal was Ilum crystal. This was found on the planet of Ambria, formed by dark connections. These crystals, when put into a lightsaber, made it so when used on anything, the blade gave it an electric shock, and it was very effective against any type of droid. There also was a Fikrin crystal, which housed the same capabilities as the Lexrum crystal, only this type was stronger and was only used by Darksiders. The next crystal on this list was the Black Wing crystal. This was created when the Black Wing virus, a zombie-like infection, spread to Dathomir and corrupted one of the crystals there, and when used in a lightsaber, the blade would emit black smoke. There also was the Demine crystal. These were typically used by Sith of larger bodies due to the crystal inside the lightsaber increasing the length and weight of the blade. It was also popularized due to its defensive capabilities. Next is the Lording Gem. These crystals were originally used to help the Loridians communicate, and when used in a lightsaber, it increased the user's understanding of the opponent and increased their defense. There also was a Velmarite crystal. Most of the time, these were used for energy equipment, but when used for a lightsaber, it made the blade thin and easy to move. Next is the Rubrak crystal, which made the end of the lightsaber a sharp point, which helped the user make precise strikes against an opponent. These crystals were originally used during the early days of the Jedi and Sith before they found Ilum. It was said that these could help increase the user's agility, speed, as well as giving them a clear mind. Next is the Seeker crystal. When used in a lightsaber, it would create a pink blade and would detect nearby people through the Force, and basically serve as a sixth sense to whoever used them. The next few crystals on this list were known as focus crystals. Starting with the Salary crystal. When used, this produced an orange blade and was widely recognized as one of the oldest crystals in the galaxy, but due to its affinity with the light side of the Force, if the user even started to use the dark side, the blade would automatically shut off, even if it was in the middle of a battle. There also was the Cash crystal, which was mainly used by Kiaris Mundi species to help clear their minds, and when used in a lightsaber, made the user very calm. Next up is the Krayt Dragon Pearl. These were created over hundreds of years when Krayt dragons would eat rocks with Kyber crystals inside of them and would form inside of their stomachs. However, this was exceptionally rare within Krayt dragons, and when put into a lightsaber, which in and of itself was a challenge, the blade would produce the same sound of a Krayt dragon roaring every time it swings. There also was the Meditation crystal on the homeworld of Tython. These crystals provided the user with a very close connection to the Force as well as a clear mind. They also helped the user regain energy when fighting. Next is the Saurian crystals. These were formed within catacombs and reflected light, and when attacking an opponent and striking against something, it would produce a fiery burst of energy. The next crystal on this list was the Liganor crystal, which was a very rare crystal, and when used in a lightsaber, increased the heat in it dramatically and also had a natural connection to the dark side of the Force. There also is a Varpline crystal, and while we don't know much about them, we do know that due to their natural density, they were used for industrial materials, but when they were used for lightsabers, they would produce a very loud hum and could cut through almost any material with ease. Next up is the Tainted Night Sister crystal. These were actually created when the Night Sisters dipped them in the oil that gifted them their Night Sister abilities, but when used in a lightsaber, it would produce green smoke like we saw with Mother Talzin fighting Mace Windu. Next is the Sigugal, which while we don't know much about it, we do know that it did increase the temperature of the blade significantly, which led many Sith and Jedi to seek out the crystal. There also was the Fang crystal, which basically was the exact same thing as the Sigugal crystal. Next on this list was the Quixani crystal. These were not found on planets, but rather were created during the explosion of a supernova, and in return made the blade much more hotter and had much more potency. It also gave the user a deeper connection to the Force. There also was the Nishlarite stones. These were formed on highly magnetic planets, and due to their origins, would become much stronger when pointing in the north direction. This next crystal was not actually one created by nature, but rather was actually created by being pooped out of an animal. Known as a Sapith crystal, these crystals when in a lightsaber was more powerful than a regular saber and also was easier to control. There also was the Orpillo crystals that increased the temperature of the blade of a lightsaber, but when refined, they were also known as Janra crystals and gave the user boosted agility. Next is the Barab ingot. These were found on the highly radioactive world of Barab 1. When used in a lightsaber, the blade was clear, and instead of being a beam of hot plasma, it became more like fire. There also was the Incineration crystal. When used, the blade produced would be thinner than the regular blade, and when used on an opponent, they would combust upon impact with the blade. Next is the Corrosion crystal, and this crystal was highly radioactive to flesh, which meant if a person was hit with the blade, their body would corrode away incredibly fast. To save time, these next three crystals will be combined into the same category due to all three of them sharing the exact same characteristics, that being immensely hot as well as causing frostbite to their opponents upon impact. These crystals were known as the Kenobi crystal, the Bar Wisdom crystal, and the Permafrost crystal. The next crystal on this list was known as the Anakari sapphire. This crystal, like some others, was deeply connected to the light side of the Force, so much so that if a Darksider tried to use it, they would receive third-degree burns. It also boosted the Force Heal ability for Force Healer. Next is Ula's Exile. When used, this would create a very potent scarlet blade that was deemed as one of the hottest blades of all time. Similar to the one before is Ula's Redemption. This crystal was infused with Night Sister magic, which meant when the user user struck the opponent, they would corrode away slowly, as well as venom from the blade would slowly move throughout their body and kill them. There also was Thynian crystals, but unlike many other crystals on this list, this was not commonly used for lightsabers, but rather for healing. But if it was used for a lightsaber, the crystals allowed the user to fight through pain and suffering with minimal consequences. Next, we have the Vexo crystal. These crystals had a dark side ability known as Force Plague, fused inside of them at all times, which meant if struck by the blade, the enemy would quickly die if not healed by the Force. There also is the Amplification crystal. These could be used with other crystals to dramatically increase their power and potency, and when used in a lightsaber would produce a rare white blade. Next is the Heart of the Guardian crystal. This was created around the same time that the Jedi and Sith were created, and was believed by the Jedi that in their greatest time of need, it would appear to bring them salvation, while the Sith believed that if the heart ever did appear, it would mean that they would take over the galaxy. And when using a lightsaber, it would greatly increase the user's speed and power. There also was a Mantle of the Force, which was very similar to the Heart of the Guardian, except for this crystal increasing the power of other crystals as well as a wielder's connection to the Force. Next is the Dragi crystal, and while in many ways this was very similar to a normal Kyber crystal used by the Jedi, these were known for making deafening sound when striking another blade. Sometimes it was even as powerful as a miniature sonic boom. There also was an Adorite crystal that shared many of the same attributes as a Dragi crystal, but instead of releasing a small sonic boom, it would be a burst of heat. Next is the Impact Condensed crystal. This was a yellow crystal that when used, seemingly made the lightsaber into a blunt object, and because of this, it could cause internal damage as well as being very difficult to defend against. The next crystal was the Lava crystal. This was only found on the deepest parts of lava planets like Mustafar, and when put into a lightsaber, the blade would become heavy and dense as well as spitting out bits of lava when making contact with other objects. The next crystal on this list is the Aralam crystal, which had the same attributes as a regular Kyber crystal, but upon being put into a lightsaber, the blade would become completely translucent, which made it near impossible to fight against. Next is the Cataract crystal. This crystal was a dark side infused crystal that housed the Force Drain ability, and when used, allowed the user to slowly drain away the life energy from their opponent, and because of that would make themselves stronger, but this would happen over an elongated amount of time. And the last crystal on this list is the Stigum crystal, and while there have been some very powerful crystals on this list, none of them even compare to this one. This crystal was so powerful that it was banned by the entire Republic and the Jedi Order. When used, it warped the perspective of reality around everyone, which meant that it could make the user seem invisible to everything, including sensors. They could even be used to cloak ships as well. And yet, for being so powerful, they were actually very common among the galaxy, but due to them being near invisible, they are also very hard to see, and because of that, were very rare. And that is every version of Kyber Crystal in Star Wars Canon and Legends. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe, as well as comment what your lightsaber would be like. And with that, my fellow Star Wars nerds, may the Force be with you.